All right. Hello and welcome to our conversation today. I'm Molly and I'm from the Salsify team, and we're going to be covering today sustainably stylish, fashioning a greener future for apparel brands. So before we get started, I just want to go over some logistics, a little housekeeping. We would love if you could join the conversation today and use the chat to message attendees or respond to the speakers. We're also going to have one or two polls for you to participate in. And then the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, you can use in order to ask questions that you'd like answered live. And we're going to have a little bit of time at the end to go over as many questions as we can get through. And then also a recording of this webinar is going to be available on demand for you to share and watch anytime. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it off to our speakers today. They're going to introduce themselves and get started on this topic.
Thanks so much, Molly. Hello, everyone. My name is Carla El Gowley. I'm based in London in the UK, and I lead our retail strategy across Europe. So that's helping forge the gap between brands and retailers as they start to think about sharing product information with one another. And sustainability and data is obviously something that's front of mind in our market today. And I'm happily joined by Amitra, who's across the pond over in the US.
Hello, everyone. I'm Amitra Tipton. I look after our Salsify practice at Amplify. For those who may not know, Amplify is a data management consultancy firm. So when it comes to harnessing the value of your data, Amplify is the consultancy firm to work with there, everything MDM, PEM, and syndication. In collaboration with Salsify as partners, we've worked with quite a few fashion and apparel customers. So I'm looking forward to talking through this topic today with Carla. All right, so let's dive into our topics. So today's discussion, we're going to be talking about environmental impacts and the role of supply chain in the apparel space specifically. We'll dive into the responses that we're seeing from customers and their competitors in the market, obviously in response to consumer expectations as it relates to sustainability, as well as the shifting industry standards. And then Carla and I will also share a sustainable approach to practices that are yielding results for apparel brands. So some exciting stuff.
Thanks, Amitra. So it goes without saying that sustainability is everywhere in this industry. Everywhere that we shop, both online and offline, we can see sustainability messages, even as much as within the labels of clothing. And it's something that will continue to be important at the center of interest on the consumer's mind. Both at brands and at retailers, we see the messaging coming at the forefront of policy. So let's think about sustainability, what it actually means and what's forcing the change. So sustainability can be thought of as meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And that's come from the United Nations. But let's think about this in a business context. So you as business owners, workers, staff can also think about this as through the lens of the impact your business might have on the environment and society as a whole. And that's taken from Harvard Business School. One of the terms that's often used when we think about sustainability in fashion is that of fast fashion. Fast fashion itself is the design and manufacturing and marketing used to focus on rapidly high producing volumes of clothing at a low price to the consumer. That's often using low quality materials, inexpensive styles, and using plastic fibers that actually pollute our oceans, wastewater, toxic dyes, as well as thinking of supply chains and underpaid workers. We see this in the press quite often, and it's truly damaging to a brand and retailer when they're kind of dragged through the message of being a fast fashion, poor environmentally impacted business. So the media plays a role, but also legislation is forcing change. And we see that the EU is itself put together a strategy for a sustainable change and sustainability and circular textiles. So the idea of this itself is to create a greener textile sector overall. The aim is to shift inside the industry itself amongst not only consumers' view, but also what brands are able to do for consumers. So that comes with producing textiles that are more durable, repairable, recyclable, and reuse and repair services that could be widely available. We're seeing brands and retailers doing this across the market here. And also in the US, Amitra, can you tell us a bit more about what's happening over there?
Oh, there we go. Within the US, we're seeing the path forward with proposed legislation around fashion sustainability at a state level. So we think about the state within the US that is leading the way right now. It's actually New York. So they're leading the way with the Fashion Sustainability and Social Accountability Act. So essentially, with this bill, there would be stipulations placed on companies generating more than 100 million in revenue to disclose business practices that positively impact sustainability. Um, and when it comes to disclosing those business practices and what that transparency looks like, we're going to dive a little bit more into that on some slides to come. But basically, holding these brands accountable, right? So if you're making a lot of money within this particular space and your brand is taking a stance, we want to make sure that you're taking action and we can measure that. Now, I will say that we see the legislation change happening more slowly, but what is happening rapidly is what global consumers want. And we're taking sustainability extremely seriously, right? So there are so many ways for consumers to gauge a brand stance on sustainability these days to determine where they're going to spend their money, right? So some popular things that I'm sure the audience has seen is third-party sustainability certificates. So if you think about energy-related certs, even organic related certs, those are especially common now. Specifically, ingredient sourcing is an interesting one. I know that Columbia is a particular fashion apparel brand where they're being transparent about where the down material in their products is coming from, and they're calling that their responsible down standard. So if you buy a Columbia jacket, they're giving you the background on where they actually source the down that's being placed in said jacket, which I think is super cool there. When we think about carbon footprint, so being conscious of environmental impacts as it relates to manufacturing and logistics. So what is your stance there and how are you measuring that is something that we see consumers pushing brands more on. And then the last one, and I can personally relate to this one. So when we think about a company's environmental policies, their hiring wages, how they're treating their workers, what their reputation is holistically as a company, that's something that a lot of consumers are taking a lot of interest in and buying accordingly, right? So Carla, you kind of referenced it where there are certain labels specifically within the industry that some brands don't want to be associated with because there are negative connotations with that. I know personally, Everlane is a brand that I purchase a lot of clothing from. Their tagline is actually clothing designed to last. They have product lines that are utilizing recycled materials, and they are very transparent about prioritizing ethical practices in factories with fair wages and quality working environments. Now, Carla, I know Salsify has done some research and work exploring how consumers are valuing sustainability. Can you share a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think to your point, the brands that come to mind as being really good, there's also the contrast where, as we touched upon, are highlighted in the media as being poor in this area. What Salsify has done every year is what we call our consumer research report, where we survey customers from the 4 biggest e-commerce markets, which you'll see on the left here. So that's both in the US, but also across Europe and the UK. And we can see here that through our 2 questions asked on this topic, so expect to see environmental impact on the product page, we're seeing as high as 19% in Germany being something really important, but also do they research the company before buying? And that's slightly higher if we look at almost a fifth, a quarter of each market, finding that important as they do shop. And I would say as a consumer myself in the UK market, it is becoming increasingly important to me. And I would be deterred from a company that didn't have that information available to me in some form. What's important about this study, which is Salsify's own and is available to download, is we're seeing other companies also run the same kind of research. So eMarketer did a deep dive, particularly across Europe. So if you look at the markets here, so nearly half of all shoppers in France, Germany, and Belgium say that they regularly or always make buying decisions based on environmental impact. So in order to make those decisions, companies need to be aware of consumers need to be aware of what companies are doing in this space and what their products do to represent environmental impact. So Amitra, take us through the areas that we're about to cover.
Yeah, so we've worked to put together what we're calling a sustainable approach to responding to these demands from consumers. And then obviously, I think we'll see ever-growing responses needed from the legislation perspective. But the first one we're going to cover is going to be promoting sustainability with circularity. So if we think of a model that's focused specifically on reuse and waste elimination, the next one is making your position visible. So talked a lot on the slides previously around brand messaging, what consumers are expecting, and how you can actually make that connection with your buyers. So essentially ensuring that consumers know your brand's position. And then the next one's going to be say no to greenwashing. So taking real action to make an impact. And I think as these standards continue to be enhanced, as they continue to grow, the expectations continue to be greater, there will be consequences and repercussions to brands that aren't adhering to these things. So I want to talk about taking the right position and putting real action back there. But we're going to dive into each one of these. I think we're going to get kicked off with circularity, Carla.
Absolutely. So you touched on this around a policy that can support the reuse, repurpose, and repair of products. So you'll see what we see as the typical circularity diagram on the left here. The United Nations actually hope that circularity will account for 10% of fashion's revenue by 2025. And I think we can all say that in the last couple of years, there's been a dramatic shift in companies solely dedicated to this purpose, but also the bigger, well-known brands and retailers in our markets that are really building this into their policy. So back in 2013, H&M was the first global fashion retailer to launch garment collection. So I know in my local H&M, if you hand a bag of used clothing in, you get £5 voucher to use on future purchase. But the idea of that is that they recycle those products. They also have markets that resell gently used or secondhand H&M clothing, which is their rewear model. We've seen Zara also launch that within their website. So we're seeing this more and more in kind of the big names. But one that I do find interesting is a luxury retailer, Selfridges in the UK, is following suit. So Selfridges is known as kind of a high-end price point, but they're actually umbrellaing within their strategy rental, repairs, and refill within what they're doing with clothing. And they hope that, again, it makes up 45% by 2030, which I think is huge goals, but it's great to see some of these bigger businesses take that as policy. Personally, the kind of things that I'm able to do as an individual in the market is use sites like Vinted to resell unwanted clothes, and admittedly some of those still have tags on, so people are even getting brand new clothing at a fraction of the original purchase price. But it allows you to kind of make contributions, so both sell products but also look to buy products secondhand. And Amitra and I were discussing as we were preparing this webinar how thrifting was kind of a trend for us in our university days, and it was quite a cool thing to do. And I actually love that that's continued to be a thing. Particularly in London, we have a lot of charity shops on high streets in quite affluent areas. So it's kind of surprising what gems you can come across as you kind of sift through the aisles. But what's going on in the US? Is that still kind of a thing? And what kind of brands are helping shift that?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm smiling. I remember a lot of thrifting days, and I would get super excited when I would find something that still had the tags on it. So to your point, you're getting an awesome item, likely unworn at a fraction of the cost there. But yeah, Carla, in the US, we're seeing something similar, right? So if we think back to the days where we used to thrift, or I remember that just being trendy with different shops, like you were saying, we've essentially seen that move upstream to the brand manufacturers directly, right? So when we think about brands like Patagonia fully adopting that sort of model with their worn wear program, right? So you have items that you purchase from the brand, and you want to send those back and have those essentially resold directly on their consumer website, their brand website, which I think is pretty awesome. Another brand that's pretty big here in the States is the North Face. So they have an actual renewed section on their website. So that allows customers to purchase items that have gone through an inspection, of course, been washed and repaired as needed. They're also a brand that's super explicit, if we look at mindful design here on this diagram, about their circular design with better sourcing, their focus on durability while generating as little waste as possible, and offering things that can be easily broken down and actually made into new gear. So I think we are seeing quite a few of these elements, if not all of them, being adopted by a few different brands here in the state for sure. So I think the circularity model is something we're seeing has become extremely common.
Exactly. And I only think that that will increase, as we were researching this, there's so many brands that are adopting the model that perhaps Patagonia forged the way for in the US. But again, like another example, Lululemon, you can bring back your leggings at any point for a new pair and they're going to recycle and repair old pairs. And that's really how I see fashion continuing to evolve. So as brands and retailers, things to think about, but things to also be really transparent about when it comes to giving information about your product and its intention and purpose. So a term that we're hearing as we talk about policy, Amitra, like we thought about, where does that policy show? Share a little bit more about, what can we advise our brands and retailers on?
Yeah, for sure. I think the biggest takeaway when we talk about making your policy visible is publicly stating your goals, right? So these days, I would say any and every brand website that you're going to go to for an apparel manufacturer specifically, you're going to have some sort of stance. And we're seeing that, right? So doing so will let the customers know where you stand as a brand. It helps build trust, and in turn, it will hold your organization accountable, right? So we are even seeing on that front there where it's not just, hey, I'm going to go to the about section for a particular brand website. I'll likely see a pledge that they've made or even how they're sourcing materials. But now we're seeing things like year-end reports, right? So a lot of brands are allocating budgets to these initiatives. So if you follow in the footsteps of an H&M, which we talked about them previously with the circularity, but and launch a dedicated sustainability oriented program. Levi's has an approach. Gradually transforming your manufacturing process is something else that we're seeing be put in the forefront. Also, again, Patagonia, I will say, stands out in the space, right? They've, I think, since the 80s, had what they call their 1% for the planet, right? Where they've pledged 1% of their sales for preservation and restoration of the environment. So again, we're able to talk about all of these things because they're visible on their website. They're publicizing these things. They're highly presented to the consumer and the customer to, like we said, build trust and hold them accountable. Obviously, tracking your progress lets the public know how close you are to achieving your sustainability goals. So the biggest thing when it comes to being able to trace these things is transparency, and that all requires data, right? So it's crucial to determine how you're going to track your process, and we're seeing a lot of brands leaning into this more and more now. Fashion brands will need to disclose the life cycles of their products, educate consumers about product durability and disposal, which I think we're seeing a lot of when you're going through that process of buying from a brand and saying, hey, I've got my use out of this, but I know they have this program I can send it back to, and I know what's going to happen to it going forward. And I'm not just throwing away these materials because they could be used for something else, right? Both companies and consumers will be encouraged to repair, recycle, and reuse clothing and footwear. So I think, again, all of this is put at the forefront. It's all visible on brand websites. And we're seeing that it's extremely common, and consumers are responding to it, I think, accordingly, right? Now, Carla, I know that it's unfortunate in some cases that not all apparel brands are taking impactful action to respond to the expectations and address the problems. But they are maybe leading the public to believe that they are. I know we want to talk a little bit about greenwashing and what this concept is.
Absolutely. So greenwashing is a term that's really come about, which is kind of the opposed tactics of what you just shared, Amitra, where we want brands to be super transparent in their marketing and the product pages on their product, but actually it's used to describe tactics by big names, fashion brand companies, where they're advertising supposedly sustainable items of clothing, or they're actually conveying false impression or misleading information about how a company's products are environmentally sound, produced, and perhaps their supply chain. And I think this term has really come about, and I touched on this earlier, but the media is playing a role in exposing those brands that are greenwashing their consumers. So I can think of an example of the well-known retailer Shein. They invited some influencers to go to their actual manufacturing factories in China with the view that they were going to be sharing what they thought was sustainable practice, supply chain, but actually the reverse of that happened in that they truly did expose some of the malpractice within that manufacturing method. And that was huge backlash and created a really negative impact on that company. So being really aware of saying exactly the truth, like if you're not in line with all the policy goals. Like, be transparent about that. You've missed something, but don't portray something as sustainable, because the likelihood is you'll be caught out. And because of this, actually, some of our markets in Europe are responding with legislation to clamp down on this kind of behavior. So specifically in France, legislation was put in place that as of January this year, brands and retailers selling in France must provide consumers with information about the environmental impacts of products. So if you think about that for apparel and footwear, that means the labeling has to be clear about the percentage of recycled materials, the future recyclability of a product, any kind of additional information under EU regulation that might be about harmful or hazardous plastics within fabrics, traceability information, so the country of origin, not just for kind of the finished garment, but all steps of the manufacturing process. So whether that's the weaving, the dyeing, the printing, etc. So the legislation is getting pretty granular to ensure that companies can't greenwash their consumers. I expect that this kind of legislation will go beyond just the requirements for physical labels, but this will play a huge role in the data and the transparency and the requirements of online brands to display this kind of information. So we only see that evolving. So let's think about, and I touched upon this just now, but like, what does that mean for online, and what does it mean for digital product experiences? And this is where Amitra and I spend most of our time with our consumers. So what does online mean for you in this space? So think about consumers who are browsing online before they make a purchase. We already know this happens. They're even doing that in store. They might research via various different points of information, whether that's at a retailer, your own D2C site, social playing a huge role here. Then as a brand, you have content and brand messaging, including information about sustainability, that needs to show up everywhere that you sell. And that's really kind of where Salsify's principle comes in helping brand manufacturers distribute product information. So we think about product information, the product title, the ingredients, again, the fabrics, but any data field that might attach itself to a sustainability message could be shared everywhere that you sell it. So if you know that that t-shirt is 100% organic cotton, that t-shirt needs to show up as 100% organic cotton absolutely everywhere that it might show up online. So it must be accurate, it must be compelling, it must be fresh. And all the reasons why we kind of invest in these product experiences is really to just foster that credibility and trust, like to ensure that you don't become one of those brands that can possibly be considered as greenwashing consumers in this space. So eMarketer ran some research last year that's kind of ways in which retailers can help digital shopping for fashion make it more sustainable. So 66 of respondents said that they would like retailers to display more detailed, accurate information about clothes, fashion products. So that goes around size, the images, the fit, the style, the material. And the reason being that they believe that shoppers are less likely to return if, in fact, the product has all that information transparently presented. And then 65% of respondents also talked about making it easier to find products. So that goes back to kind of when you're searching on a website, if you type in sustainable, it's now coming up as a category on certain retailers. And I show the example of Nike here. So they're kind of declaring here that they've got at least 20% sustainable material in that list of almost 3,000 products that they send online. Now, your product will not show up in that category if the underlying data isn't available within the product page itself. So we'll talk more around tactics specifically on where you house the data and how that data should be shared. But I want to touch on something that was mentioned here around returns. So as we know, returns is a huge problem for the fashion industry and continues to be. And mostly it's around size and fit, but it could be on other things. So I'm just going to run a poll now because I'm really interested to understand the kind of tactics that you as brands might be running in order to kind of ensure that your product falls into to reduce negative environmental impact. So I'm just going to launch the poll here and that should pop up for everyone. So does your company have any of the following tactics in place to reduce the negative environmental impact? So we talked about returns just briefly now, but also things like delivery methods, whether that's kind of electric vehicles, recycled packaging. I think that's a huge one. I'm seeing even like the actual packaging itself having things like please reuse me or recycle here, sustainable materials used within your products itself. So those are kind of the 4 areas that we see, and I'm just going to wait a few minutes to have the respondents kind of answer here, and then maybe share some tactics on one of these methods. Just give it a few more minutes. Thanks to those who've already responded. I'm getting a few more answers trickle through. So far we're seeing sustainable materials coming up top. So businesses are already having tactics in there, closely followed by recycled packaging. So as I said, I'm seeing that specifically as I order online being a lot more prevalent. And so far, nothing for reducing returns or for environmental delivery methods. And I think those 2 are probably actually the 2 harder ones to resolve at speed. So I'm going to end the poll, and I'm just going to touch upon one of these areas, because it's interesting that no one had any tactics in place for reducing returns. So let's just think about returns and what that means. So again, I'm referencing eMarketer here. We see in the US that it accounts for 22% of all online returns. So that's kind of a disproportionate share of e-commerce returns around the apparel industry. The number 1 reason at the top being size, fit, and color was wrong. And we do see that, and we know that as consumers, unless you know a specific size is really consistent at a brand. I'm guilty of it too. I quite often will order 2 or 3 sizes. I'm in a range and just hope like one of them fits, the rest are going back. It's very easy. But let's just have a little think about that. You know, what happens to that returned item? Well, first of all, I repackage it. Hopefully I'm being good and I've used the packaging it came in. But then it has to travel back to the warehouse. So that's fuel consumption itself. The returns process will be more steps for the garment once it reaches said retailer. So they might need to be reconditioned, repaired. Some of them go into landfill, which is possibly the worst part of all and may never be resold. And then some will be repackaged to be shipped out again. Again, repackaging means extra materials. And again, the old packaging often ends up in the rubbish. Hopefully it's recycled. But if you just think about this whole journey of what happens to that single product that you mistakenly order, or because you didn't think the color then matched the image on the website, or the sizing wasn't right because you didn't really have the tips to know, did it run big, did it run small? So these are some of the things that in that space around fit, I've seen as tactics from European retailers. So Zalando, and we know this as a big retailer, HQ in Germany, strong in the apparel industry. So they've implemented an AI-powered function sizing tool. So you actually upload a picture of yourself, and it will give you the measurements and spit out the perfect size for said item. There's other technologies that retailers are investing in that do this, such as TrueFit, which essentially gathers customer information on the typical sizing for that individual product, and gives you here, you can see kind of the sliding scale of whether it's true to size, small, large. Another way to do this is actually to gather information from your return slip. So most of the time consumers tick a box which tells you whether it was big or small, didn't fit right, was the color off. And all of that information can also be in customer reviews. So how do you use the data that you've got at play to start to put better information on the PDP about that product? So whether you decide to invest in tools or whether you use the data you already have, these are great things around returns, which we see as kind of one of the biggest problems. The second answer that there was no tactics on was around deliverable methods. So I know, for example, Amazon have made huge progress in using electric fleets. And I think, yeah, that is big change management within a business that perhaps has long-standing relationships with certain logistics companies. The other way is kind of to offer the consumer, if let's say you've ordered a couple of items and one's going to come in a separate package. I've recently had a pop-up that said, like, do you mind waiting for all to come in one package, or do you desperately need the first one to come separately? And as a consumer, I'm able then to decide, well, actually, yeah, I can wait the extra few days so that it's one delivery and it's one package. So there's a lot going on in that space that you can kind of quickly implement, but also longer term investments. So we've talked a bit about returns and the investments that we make in that, but really kind of the core to what we want to talk to you about is around how data plays a role in all of this. So I'm just going to run a second poll just to get a sense from the audience around the ways in which you're able to manage data today. So let me just relaunch to the previous poll. Okay, here we go. So currently, what is your status in managing product information, visibility on sustainability factors? So the first option is you have it really well organized, you have a central source of truth, the content is updated regularly, and it's reflected absolutely everywhere that product might sell. The second one is like, we're struggling to ensure that sustainability features are reflected online. And the last one is like, in all honesty, you don't know where to begin in this space. You know, it's quite a complex thing. Data may be sporadically spread across, you know, production may have the actual fabric component, but marketing doesn't. So just give it a few minutes. So what I can see here is that the second answer is the highest, with 67% of our audience saying that they're struggling to ensure that those features are reflected online. So I'm just going to end that poll. And Amitra, you've got experience in how brands can actually help kind of do this, and you've partnered with Salsify as one of your key partners in order to develop technical solutions to help with data. So I'll let you explain a bit more about how we see brands in this space doing it.
Yeah, absolutely. So just a few of the ways that Salsify specifically is helping fashion brands solve a lot of these problems that Carla was just describing. I think the top use case that we see with our customers when they're looking to adopt a platform like Salsify is centralizing all of their product data, right? So if you think about all of the data points that will accurately describe your product, we want those in one place. And so all the departments that are working within these fashion and apparel brands, having a single system that's going to have that product record for you in there. So if we think about the needs of sales or merchandising, the marketing resources, and of course, e-commerce, we've talked a lot about how all of the data that we're gathering is going to support our brand messaging, going to support our product characteristics, the things that we're going to see on the label, and all the traceability that goes into the sustainability around the products. Being able to show that on the web, it's all going to start with where are we actually storing it, and do all the necessary parties have access to that data. So that's really a main driver, right? So a lot of times we're working with customers that have data in disparate systems. They may say, you know what, we're actually just working offline today. So they may have data in different spreadsheets, and that may be the actual process for them to go through and launch product lines. And it's obviously not as efficient as having a system like a Salsify. So we see that as a really, really big driver there. Another one, I think similar to that track, is helping these brands consolidate redundant systems, right? So a lot of times the systems that may be in place may honestly be a bit archaic. They may not be as modern, as quick for teams to work with data, not that flexible to get data in and out of the system. So think about also placing Salsify within the ecosystem to reduce some of those redundant point solutions that may be existing today. That's something else that we're seeing. I know specifically from working with a lot of fashion and apparel brands, there's a very specific way that they manage their data. So if we think about managing their sprawling assortments, so year over year, you're producing product, right? You may have something that's a high performer that you're going to bring back and like pull through season over season, but a lot of time you're producing new products and new product lines, and there are going to be different variants there. So we think about the concepts of styles, colors, and sizes, and being able to represent data for these fashion apparel brands in the way that they see it. Salsify is really good at that, right? So obviously within that space, we're going to say, hey, for a given style, it's going to come in these color and sizes, and there are common data points across those things, being able to push that in an efficient way with different functionality, where we're not having teams key in things over and over, and it's consistent and it's accurate. Another huge win there. Obviously, a really, really big one is going to be accelerating time to market. So we think about being able to collaborate and orchestrate across teams with workflows. That is a huge win and a huge benefit that we've seen a lot of our customers that we've worked with love about the platform, right? So if we think about from the onset of going from a concept or an initial design for a product line that they're going to launch for a given season, and being able to have different merchandisers contribute the data as they need to represent the product accurately. And then from there, we have an idea of what we're going to actually be selling to our customers. And now let's put the messaging behind that. What do we actually want the consumers to see? And digital is going to now come in, and they're going to do their part of the workflow. And it's a very streamlined, traceable process, right? Where we're able to have that consistency and that efficiency and that collaboration across the teams, I think is huge. And then, of course, when you implement something such as these sorts of workflows, your time to market and the efficiency that you're getting out of being able to launch things faster, allow your team to be freed up from doing redundant, highly manual tasks to focus more on high value adds is another big win there. Big one when we think about empowering teams. I know a function that Salsify does possess that I have seen other brands work in a more traditional and I'll say old-fashioned sense is when we think about catalogs. So I know when I was a kid, I was actually obsessed with print catalogs. So I would always look in print catalogs and circle everything that I wanted for like a holiday or something. But now we're seeing that that's not as quick or as fast or as efficient for these brands. So being able to have a way to display your products and your product content for internal and external consumers. So if we think about a digital product catalog that your internal sales team can use at their disposal to work with trading partners, work with different retailers, showcase your products, et cetera. And then even trading partners when it comes to the buying process. You may say, hey, I want to streamline how you can actually see what's coming up in the upcoming season. You have those abilities. It's super modern, super advanced from the old days of sitting, spreadsheets and print catalogs, et cetera. And then last but not least, when we think about sharing our product info downstream, that's the slam dunk of Salsify that we've seen, right? So being able to offer those efficiencies with syndication. So I love the example that Carla gave that if this is going to be an organic cotton t-shirt, everywhere I go and look at that particular t-shirt or that knit, it should say that, right? So being able to have that data centralized in a system like Salsify, and perhaps for one given retailer that you sell it to, it may be a bullet point. For someone else, it may be a description, but you have the ability to slice and dice your data as you need to and still present that consistent product and brand message on different platforms. And that not only applies to e-commerce websites for different retailers, but also the PDPs on your own website as well, right? So you have control of the data. And then I know, Carla, in the poll, there may be some consumers that say we're not accurately representing these things on e-commerce because we just don't have the data yet, right? So you're not alone. That is something we've seen with a lot of customers, but again, it's all about setting the foundation. And once that foundation is set, you're able to turn to enhancing your data dictionary and saying, hey, you know what? There are more data points that we could be including to improve our sales, reduce our returns. You're able to focus on those things because you're not doing highly manual tasks anymore. So those are a lot of the wins that we've seen specifically with fashion brands using Salsify. And I know as a joint customer that we both share, I did want to kind of give the audience a quick overview of an actual implementation so you guys can just get an idea and kind of tie a lot of those values of the platform to what we've actually seen for an actual business. So a specific outdoor and adventure apparel brand, so quite large, here had those challenges that I was just talking about that Salsify helps solve, right? So standardizing their processes because they had a lot of things that were in spreadsheets. They were using a project management software to kind of track these manual tasks where everyone's collaborating over email, or maybe they're even having joint meetings where they're having to go over briefs, et cetera, and kind of go through their different stage gates. So getting past that. And then obviously highly manual syndication process. So if you think about some of these organizations today that are literally going directly into PDPs on their given e-commerce platform and making data alterations, there isn't any throughput that's streamlined from a central source of truth for them to actually dictate and govern their data. So huge challenges there. So our approach specifically was a phased approach, which is how Amplify commonly tackles our engagements with customers, we wanted to enable that core solution. So if you think about as a brand today, what are your current pain points that if you were freed up from those things, you could go and advance your business and start performing and excelling even more? We want to start there, right? So obviously, what's your data model going to look like? We need to get all the data in the system. And then also the people and the process side of these things. So ensuring that we're able to realize value as quickly as possible from a Salsify implementation is really the driver at the forefront of these engagements. And then, of course, making sure once that foundation is set, then we're able to continue to add value utilizing the platform by building out additional capabilities and syndication channels, right? So for this particular brand, they were hyper-focused on their spring 23 launch. So that was our MVP solution going in. We knew we had to go live in spring with that particular season. And we were able to do that, right? We centralized their data into a single source of truth. This was going to be a global solution for them. So we had to take that into account that this was something that they were going to scale. So making sure that the foundation properly set them up for that success. Obviously, taking those processes out of their e-commerce platform, out of those spreadsheets, all that enrichment that was happening outside of a system, downstream, so on and so forth, making sure we're able to pull that upstream into Salsify as their PIM. And then making sure that all of the data that we were able to govern in the system was prepared as we needed to properly serve downstream consumers, right? So to quickly hit the benefits that everyone can read through on the screen here, having that single source of truth, huge win for them, right? All that manual effort is now being removed. Consistent, concise, and complete delivery of product information. I think that's the real key nugget for everyone to take away today after we've been discussing sustainability, is that those are going to be the characteristics of the brands that are going to be leaders specifically, right? When we talk about this specific problem and the call to action, having consistent, concise, and complete data. That's going to be the huge nugget there to take away. And then efficient management of their data and asset through that collaborative orchestration of workflows that I touched on the previous slide. So again, just a case study of a joint apparel customer of Amplify and Salsify and how we were able to solve a lot of their specific needs using the tool.
Great story. Thanks, Amitra. I think one of the things that jumps out here is like, this is actually a huge global brand. So the way that this brand needed to scale this data across many markets, many digital touch points, whether that was social, marketplaces, retailers, their own D2C site, like that key thing about having the central truth, but also it's a central place of work. So being able to adapt that data to different languages, different retail requirements, which you touched upon, which is often a challenge. You know, one retailer wants a bullet point, one retailer wants a list. Like being able to just quickly identify the requirements of the retailer from the Salsify platform and publishing to that retailer seamlessly means that, you know, the go-to-market of products and the changes of updating a product just becomes a really seamless process versus what historically used to often be like, we need to fill out a whole new line form. We need to make sure that it's checked by 3-4 different people internally. We can't find the image. It lives in someone's Google Drive. And we hear these stories all the time. And, you know, brands that are kind of lost in it. And we saw from the answer that some are kind of, we have some data, it's somewhat centralized, but then like getting it out there is what seems to be the challenge. And that's really one of the principles of the Salsify product experience management platform, is that it's not just kind of the core PIM, which typically is like one form of the data in one place, but it's actually the adaptation of that through workflows and editing and getting it out there. So this is just one of the great stories that we've shared together. And we know that this really, really helps brands in the industry. So we're coming up on time, but let's just summarize, Amitra, like what do we want these brands and retailers to really take away from today?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say for the audience, the key takeaways that I hope that everyone was able to gather and will tie back to the specific webinar is that data-driven tactics are key for the brand to respond to what consumers care about, right? We focus specifically on sustainability. What's the call to action from the consumers and what we're expecting? And you have to have the data to show that, right? So we've seen it in the poll. We've talked about the impact of utilizing a technology like Salsify will have on your PDP, your brand messaging, how your products are represented across multiple mediums. So again, it's all data driven. Keep that in mind. Also, requirements for traceability, transparency, about brand and product are everywhere and do require tech investment, right? So when we think about being able to expose all the information that you want to share, making sure that that's as efficient as possible, it's likely going to require some sort of tool, right? So I think, Carla, I love the way that you put it about Salsify. Not only is it a centralized place for the data, but it's a centralized place of work. So keeping in mind the impact of not only having the technology, but what the technology enables your people to do and how those processes are like exponentially improved is another one. And then also, I think the audience probably gathered that the expectations in the sustainability space are ever changing, right? So we've kind of talked about how the legislation is starting to be rolled out. I believe that's going to continue to happen, and it's going to be pretty rapid, to be honest, based off of what we're seeing. But it's critical for brands to have a set foundation with the ability to remain agile to meet consumer and industry needs. So if you think about what the expectations today are from consumers, and somewhat from a legislation perspective, if you don't even have the foundation set to meet those, imagine how behind the eight ball you're going to be when things start to pick up and the demand is even higher for how your brand takes a position within sustainability. So again, key takeaways for the audience, specifically as it relates to sustainability and fashion apparel.
Thanks very much. So we do have some time for questions. So a couple have come through. Any that we don't manage to address, we are more than happy to respond via email. Amitra and I can be found on LinkedIn. We're totally open to continuing this conversation as you look to explore it further. But Amitra, one of the questions that came through from a brand here is, how quickly can a company realize value when they look to invest in a solution like Salsify's? What kind of timeframes? And we touched on what the value should be, but when do they see it? How quickly do you typically see brands?
Yeah, I'll say honestly, it's pretty common for us to see brands realizing value almost immediately. So if we look at that case study that I gave, think about an average implementation of, let's say, like 12 to 14 weeks for their PXM solution within Salsify, but we were already gearing up for a spring 23 launch, right? So as soon as everything was done, they were pushing their products to their brand website. They had teams working in parallel to our implementation, actually enriching their data and being able to see the benefits of, oh, I load that into the Salsify system, and this is what our products are represented as in here. And if I click this publish button, it's going downstream to the website. So it's almost immediately when you think about the enablement, the education that your teams are getting throughout even the implementation process. And then obviously when a company like an Amplify as a consultancy is able to walk away and make sure that those customers are self-sustaining, as soon as they're like, all right, we're live now, they've already started getting value. And that's again our approach. So as quickly as possible, we want to see organizations that of course acknowledge the necessary change management, but for those brands, they're able to see it immediately for sure. And one thing that I do want to plug before we run out of time, we'll probably get back to some more questions here. But if anyone is going to be in Boston for Fashion Week, Amplify and Salsify are jointly hosting a dinner cruise. So we're going to be sailing out into the Boston Harbor. It's going to be great for networking opportunities with other leaders in the fashion space. So again, if you're going to be in Boston during Fashion Week, really hope to see you there.
Awesome.
Do you have any more questions, Carla?
I would absolutely love to get on a flight and be on that dinner cruise. It sounds delightful. Another question here, which I'll take actually. So how can visual content tell a story about a brand, and is there ways Salsify can help with that? So we didn't touch upon this in any of our examples today, but Salsify have what we call our enhanced content solution. So that's content that sits typically below the fold on a retail page. You may know it as rich media. Amazon coined it A+ content, but that allows you then to, through visuals, whether it's kind of videos, images, feature bullets, comparison charts, tell a story. And again, if sustainability is at the forefront of your brand story or that specific product, it's a great way to add additional content for consumers to see on product pages. So Salsify has a tool for which brands build that, and it's actually really quick and easy to scale because, as Amitra talked about, all that content is already in a central place. So that's both your digital assets, but also your words around that SKU, so the description, etc. And what the tool allows brands to do is kind of create modules built up of the content that already exists, and pull it all into one visual piece that can then be syndicated out to other retailers. So, for example, we supply it to Amazon today for those brands that sell there. So again, enhanced content and rich media telling that brand story, and that might be around sustainability or other factors, is a really good way to showcase. It's also a great way to kind of have a bit of control over the product page as a brand. Quite often we see on a D2C site, obviously you own that site, you have full remit and creativity around what a product page looks like. And then the retailers have a little more control over what their consumer journey looks like. But as we see more retailers wanting to enhance that experience for their consumers, visual content is starting to get on their radar, specifically in Europe. I think the US has been doing a really good job of it. Walmart, Target, two of our other huge partners that are doing this. So that's something, if that's something of interest, again, reach out, we can discuss more about that. But we see typically around 10% uplift in conversion when that additional enhanced content is added. So as you start to think about how quickly can you gain impact, that allows you to truly impact conversion at speed and scale. So I think we're almost at time, unless there's kind of any more questions from anyone in the audience. We're happy to spend a few more minutes if anyone has any more. And if not, we'll kind of wrap up with that. So thank you so much, Amitra, for joining me today, sharing some real life examples. Super hot topic, really interesting. I think we're all kind of in the headspace about how do we make a bit of impact and change in what we do when we shop apparel. And we're actually presented with so many options now, and it really comes down to truly understanding the brand message and the sustainability factors in an individual product. So thank you. Huge thanks to the audience. As Amitra said, those of you that are stateside or those of you that can fly out to Boston for Fashion Week, we would love to see you on our joint cruise. Again, any other questions, please feel free to reach out to either of us. And we are happy to keep the conversation open.
Yeah, absolutely. This was great. Thanks, Carlin. Thanks everyone for attending.